Hello everyone, my name is Mark Mandel and welcome to Being Successful with Open Source in Game Development. I'm a developer advocate at Google Cloud and I work on a few different open source projects that exist in the games industry. So hopefully you'll find this interesting and we'll delve into some varying aspects of open source in the wider tech community as well as in the games industry. So I know this is a recorded presentation, but I thought we'd try and get some interactivity happening as I believe I'm hanging out with you in the chat server right now as well. So I'd love to hear in the chat right now is if anyone has written open source software, such as maybe a pull request or push stuff up to GitHub. If you have anything like that, I'd love to hear about what you've submitted code to. Also, if anyone considers themselves an open source maintainer, would love to hear about what projects y'all are working on and maybe promote those in chat as well. Finally, also very curious if anyone else in the games industry here gets paid to work on open source projects, much like I do actually, which is really cool too. So I'd be really curious to see how that exists across all the people who are currently watching this right now and hanging out together in the chat server to hear your experiences. That would be super cool as we go through. So while that's going on, let's get stuck in. Okay, so I want to narrow the scope here a little bit. So what do I mean by open source? So what I want to talk about actually is free and open source software. So taking straight from Wikipedia, that means it is software that is free, as in you don't have to pay for it. But it is also under some sort of open source license that has basically some sort of permissive license, like you can do what you like with it. Something like Apache, MIT, something like that. So that gives a little constraint there too. And then I want to narrow things a little bit further because there are a wide variety of different types of open source in the world. You'll see there's actually like whole open source games. That's the whole thing. I don't want to necessarily talk about that today. What I want to talk about is what I commonly refer to as plumbing. What do I mean by that? I work in a space generally where the open source tools that I build and also the ones I tend to interact with tend to be foundational pieces that people can build things on top of. So I refer to this as plumbing, for example, right? To build a house, you have to have plumbing, right? If you don't have it, bad things happen. You can't get water from different places in the house. But it's not the plumbing inside your house that's going to make, people love your house or potentially if you want to sell your house or buy your house, right? It doesn't make or break your house, but it is a foundational thing that you need to have. But no one's walking into your house and be like, really nice plumbing you have in there. That's not a thing that's going on. But like I said, you have to have it. So I want to consider open source projects that are really kind of foundational, libraries for things that are reused all over the place, right? You may necessarily can think of projects that you've worked on that you probably have rewritten maybe 3 or 4 times as you moved from different companies or even in the same company as well. So that's what I mean by foundational. Usually it's not your proprietary game specific logic or anything like that. It's like, hey, I've built an asset pipeline a million times. I've built this infrastructure for backend systems a million times. I wish there was one standard for that. Those are the sort of projects I want to talk about. So to set some context, I work on a project called Agones. It's a system for orchestrating dedicated game servers. If those terms mean nothing to you, that's totally fine. It's a project we've been running for probably about 3 years now. And it's got a wide number of contributors from a variety of different studios. Some GitHub stats here. You can see we've got 3.4 thousand stars on it. We've had almost 100 contributors from both inside and outside Google. It's been a pretty successful project. We started it way back in the day with a major game company, and we've had a lot of input and a lot of innovation and a lot of really great people come to the project and help out. It's been hugely, hugely successful. But to draw that out a little wider, I think, this project, Agones, is actually built on top of another very successful open source project. So if you do anything in the backend services or infrastructure space, you've definitely heard about Kubernetes. Kubernetes is basically the de facto standard for doing large-scale distributed systems, and is a massively, massively popular open source project. Originally created, inside Google, and then help from a variety of factors, and now it belongs to an organization, but with people from Apple and Red Hat and IBM and a whole huge number of very large corporations. You can see here almost 3,000 contributors, 71,000 stars, lots and lots of work on this, and really it powers so much of backend systems across gaming and wider tech as well. And to go maybe even a one step further as well, like to see how big open source is in wider tech, this is a conference. We remember conferences. I don't know if everyone remembers them back in the day when we could all gather in one place at the same time. But this is Cloud Native Compute Foundations. Basically, actually, they are an organization in the Linux Foundation, and they manage about a dozen projects, one of which is Kubernetes, we were just talking about previously. They run 4 of these events around the world, or at least they used to. And this is 8,000 people who all descended upon this conference center just to hang out and talk about and learn about these like dozen projects that are all open source. That's how big open source is in the wider tech. This many people come to these kind of events to learn about these things because it dictates the kind of work that they're doing. To go even further, if you do anything in open source, you're going to come into GitHub. That is sort of the central place that a lot of this stuff happens. This is some stats from last year. 40 million active developers, 140 million repositories, like 140 million projects that exist on GitHub right now, and 287 million pull requests in 2019. So a pull request is a contribution, if you're not familiar with the term, right? 287 contributions to open source projects during that time. Like just massive amounts of work. So like it is a massive industry. Google, Red Hat, Microsoft, Facebook, Twitter, Lyft, IBM, they're all paying people to work on open source as well as people doing it within their own free time. So massive amounts of adoption of open source and wider tech. So I want to say something possibly slightly controversial. Games are software, right? This is a strong opinion of mine. I know there's so much artistic merit and so much talent that goes into making games such an artistic medium and a creative medium, but at the end of the day, we're making software. And so there is so much stuff to be gained by looking at the wider tech community and saying, hey, they're doing some cool stuff. We should possibly pull in what they're doing and bring it to ourselves. And I'm positing here that open source is one of those things that I think would be really beneficial to the games community. So let's get into brass tacks, right? Like, what's in it for me? Let's talk about this quite commercially as well. Why would I want to look at this as an individual and as a business? Why do I care at all? And like at a high level, there's some stuff in there as well around, sort of personal feelings and why people want to get involved with open source. If you want to get into the theory of motivation, things like autonomy, mastery, and purpose, things that drive people to being successful or learning new things. These are aspects of that. And you should definitely look at Daniel's video some more about that as well. So there's a lot of reasons why people get involved with open source, especially if they're dedicating their free time. But there's a lot of commercial reasons. So let's get stuck into that. So first, let's look at open source as a company. If I'm a company, maybe I'm a game studio, something similar, and I'm like, why do I want to start stuff and look at it as open source? Why do I care? So first things first, it's all about wider talent pool. You create an open source project, you put it out into the world. Suddenly you have access to a wide number of developers or users who are going to look at your project, take it for a spin, provide you feedback, maybe submit some code. And often that's just a diverse set of opinions and a diverse set of perspectives and talents taking advantage of the tool that you built. And that means that you have the opportunity to build a product that is better than you may necessarily have done just doing it inside. And this can be a huge educational boon for your company, but also like just means that you have a better product overall. That's pretty awesome. Another reason, potentially, maybe because you want to set the standard. This is another good one as well. So maybe you're looking to speed up how onboarding happens inside your company. People come in and there's a lot of tools they need to understand and learn how to use. If you have an open source project, you may be like, oh, cool. Once we have this open source project out in the world, maybe we can make this the standard for doing this thing across the industry. And suddenly, if that becomes the case, everyone who's coming into your company can now onboard much faster. Also, it's great for your company. Like you'll be like, we're the company that set this standard. And it all becomes really nice for you as well. But it can definitely help with that onboarding, that education process. And also it just kind of means that, you as new people come into your company, or even just the games industry as a whole, they have less hurdles to go through, and there's less tribal knowledge that exists just within your company. It's more open and out there, and it enables people to really build on that knowledge to build, the next generation of games or be the next generation of game developers coming through, which is also super nice. Raising visibility. This is a fun one as well. So open source can just be a great marketing tool for your company, which is nice as well. So as part of maybe building out your game, there are already some amazing companies that are game studios that do engineering blogs, for example. This can be part of that outreach, part of that visibility, part of that publicity for your company to be like, hey, look at the things we're doing. We're going behind open source. You can see the work that we're doing, and maybe you might want to be involved with that. You can come hang out with us either online in these communities doing that kind of work. And that makes people more aware of the games you might be building and the other things that you might be doing. And it just becomes a nice part of your marketing tool for what it is that you do to drive that forward, which is kind of cool. Leading into that visibility thing, I want to lean into hiring as well. I put a little asterisk there. We'll talk about that in a minute. But hiring open source work, it's an opportunity to meet more people, see what their work is like, see what their communication style is like, so you can actually see very quickly, or potentially even like over a certain amount of time as you're working with someone, hey, this person does excellent work because we've worked with them in open source. Maybe that's someone we should hire. I put a small asterisk there. I just want to say this is an additional pipeline to your normal hiring process. Please don't make it the pipeline. Unless you're someone who gets paid to do open source, the people who do open source tend to be the people who have the free time to do open source, and that skews in certain directions demographically. So please keep it in mind as like a pipeline, but it doesn't have to be the pipeline. But it can be a great avenue when you're trying to hire people because you'll have worked with them already. So you have a bit of an idea of exactly how they do stuff, which may be a little bit better than just doing a standard interview, which can be super nice. Cool. So that gives you some ideas for like, as a company, why you might want to get involved with open source. And I strongly recommend if you are, as a company, wanting to do that, make sure you set some goals. Make sure you decide as a company what your goals are for open source projects or just open source in general. Before diving in, I know necessarily, there can be a drive to be like, open source is cool, but having good reasons to drive into there and really dig into that can really set the tone. And then you can track those reasons and see whether or not you're actually meeting them as you go forward as well. Then there's an individual perspective too. So maybe as a company, you want to do it one way, but if I'm an individual person, why would I want to be involved either as part of my company or maybe on my own? Commercially, what's the good things? So this is one of my favorites, having worked at companies. Sometimes you have to cut corners to get deadlines done, certain amount of pressure because of certain, things coming down the pipe, and technical debt's a thing. You do what you have to do to get things out the door. Open source is a great opportunity to build something, I say, quote unquote, the ideal way. Because you're building it together in this open community amongst people, quite often things get debated, there's an open consensus about how things get made, and usually you're looking for the most optimal solution there. Often also open source projects don't really have deadlines per se in many cases. So there isn't the, we'll just do this right now and we'll go fix it later, knowing full well that you're never going to go back and fix it unless something horribly, horribly breaks. So open source really can be that great opportunity to build a tool like in the optimal way, in the way you've always wished it was done. And then once you've done that, then you can actually go and use it somewhere else too, which is cool. So no longer having to be like, I hate using that thing. Now you're like, there's this open source thing that's been working and a bunch of people are using it. It's awesome. Let's pull that in. And now we have like the ideal tool that you always wanted for that job. Job security is always a fun one too. This leans a little bit into what we were talking about previously around setting the standard. If you can build an open source tool and it gets adopted in a number of game studios or game companies, suddenly that gives you a lot of opportunity for new jobs. But like specifically, like you're like, I have security in my job because the thing that I work on means that means that I have opportunity to go at a variety of places, right? It becomes yet another thing to put in your resume that is a standard across the industry to be able to be like, cool, I work on this, and it's used everywhere. And since I know it really well, in fact, maybe I even built it or I've contributed to it, that means that, I can now go to Y company. I don't have to onboard very fast there. They use the same tool. They're looking for people who use it. Becomes a really nice opportunity for you to be able to have good job security over the industry because you have a transferable skill that is very easy to move from one place to another. Leading into that conversation as well, hiring opportunities. So maybe if you started something, right, that kind of thing, it becomes a standard, that's awesome. But, flip that around. Maybe you just get involved as a contributor to a project. And maybe it's a company that you're interested in hiring with, right? You're like, oh, this is a great company. They're doing open source work. I'll go, check out their repositories, maybe become a contributor, maybe get involved. That is, again, the other side of what we were talking about previously about hiring. That gives you a good chance to actually look at that company, see how they communicate, how they build software. They can get to know you, and that can provide hiring opportunities in of itself. So it is a two-way street in that aspect as well. You get to know what it is they know, what their perspectives are, how they build stuff, how they communicate, and that gives you a good chance to be like, this seems like a cool place I might want to work. Or maybe it's somewhere you don't want to work, which is totally fine as well. So I think that's really also a really nice opportunity to get to know people, and is a great benefit of open source as well. And I think it kind of goes without saying about education. Education's a big thing here. So not only is it a chance to look at maybe building something new and then getting other people involved and getting their perspective and get their knowledge that you may or may not have on that particular topic. By the same token, going to contribute at another project, seeing how it works, seeing how it's built, learning how that stuff works. That's a great thing. But I think also it's worth noting that open source is a community. And open source really becomes this repository of information, of best practices, past experiences, trade-offs, and decisions made that are, I feel, kind of invaluable, actually. Going back through maybe the design docs that exist for open source or around certain things, and seeing where the debate comes up or where decisions got made and trade-offs occurred can be hugely valuable for people who may be up and coming, or even experienced people as well. I think there's so much value in that. By the same token, so many open source projects have chat rooms and Google groups, mailing lists, where you can ask questions and discuss things with like-minded individuals. So well worth your time getting involved that way, just because it is just that opportunity to grow and hit maybe a few more people than you would necessarily outside your company. Maybe you have a small team you're working on and you want to get some more diverse opinions, or maybe just have a conversation with someone outside of the pressures of work. That can be hugely valuable as well. Okay, that all sounds amazing, right? I've given you the spiel. I've definitely given you the sales pitch. Here's a lot of amazing stuff, and I'm sure there's more amazing stuff we could definitely have covered as well. But ultimately, nothing is free, right? There are some costs to running open source or being involved with open source, especially since I said we're going to talk about this from a commercial point of view. So let's talk about what those costs are. And ultimately, the way I look at it is how do we define success? And ultimately, how do we make sure that our project is successful? So let's say we're building a project, right? Let's look at this from maybe a company point of view, or maybe you're an individual contributor and you've decided to build a project, right? We want something to be healthy. We want lots of engagement. We want people to adopt this project, right? That's our metric for success. How do we build a successful project, and what sort of things do we need to do to actually make that happen? And I think there are several things we want to talk about. So first things first, have a code of conduct and enforce it. This is hugely important. Having a good, healthy, inclusive culture for your open source project is hugely important because it matters to the people who are coming and means that people were willing to come and engage on your project over a long period of time. The vast majority of people who are going to be coming to open source are doing this for free, essentially, right? They're doing it because of their own free will. And if they're not enjoying the experience, they're just going to go. So making sure that you have an inclusive environment is really kind of beneficial for you to get more people involved with your project, and a great set of people who you're enjoying working with in that project. And the first step for that really is about having a code of conduct, and just ensuring you enforce it as well, right? Good code of conduct, and we'll have a link later to some great ones that you can just kind of take and work with straight out of the bat, been adopted by a number of companies and projects. And it gives you step-by-steps as well, layers of where and how things should be enforced and how to set that up as well. But yeah, hugely important, because it immediately sets the tone for the project, and it's better to set this up from the outset than trying to do this in reverse once something unfortunately happens in your community. And hopefully it doesn't happen, but better to be prepared than try and do it after the fact. It can get messy, which is unfortunate. Second one that I can't talk about enough is marketing. If you build an open source project and it's amazing, but you tell no one about it, unfortunately, it may not be successful. So what does that mean? You need to write blog posts about it. You need to go to conferences and talk about it. You need to go to meetups and talk about it. Now that would be virtually, but yes. But you need to do a marketing cycle for this as new stuff comes out, have social media accounts, set up YouTube, do videos, all that kind of normal stuff you would do for a regular product, you also want to do for your open source work. Just as important, because ultimately there is a plethora of open source out there, and you want to get it out into the outside world. Reddit, things like that, any kind of social media, any kind of community management you do around that, you also want to do around your open source project, and continue doing it as you keep building new features and that kind of fun stuff. You want to build a community, people who are engaged with it, so you got to do the marketing work, let people know. Commit early, commit often. This is a thing that I think is really important. There are a bunch of different software development models inside open source. There's ones that I like specifically, but I think a good tenet to think of is try and get your software into your users' hands as quickly as possible so that they can test it and use it and test it and give you feedback back on that. One of the ways we do it on our project, which I really like and I actually quite highly recommend, is having timed releases. So we release every 6 weeks. We do a 5-week sprint, and then we have 1 week release candidate, and then we release every 6 weeks. We're a pretty active project, so depending on the size and how much work you have in your project, that may or may not fit for you. But having regular releases means that what happens, we don't have to wait for certain features. Sometimes if you do feature-based releases, so we're like, we'll do a release when this feature's finished, that can drag on into, we've almost halfway through the next feature, so maybe we'll wait on that. We'll just wait another, and then like suddenly it's been 3 months, 6 months before you've got a release, and you've got this massive release getting out. What's been great about 6-week releases, so it comes every 6 weeks, like clockwork. Doesn't matter whether a feature's finished or not. That's fine. We actually hide stuff behind feature flags if need be. That's okay. It's not documented. Like, you can just sit there. It's fine. And it gets out. And so anything that keeps coming through, any new feature, there's a really quick release cycle. And even if there's a bug that doesn't require a hot fix, it's not going to be that far down the road that you're going to get another release, and you can play with it. So commit early, commit often. Just try and find a strategy that enables you to get stuff into your users' hands as quickly as possible once changes get made. Be attentive to the community. This is another fun one. I like to start this with, there are studies out there that I need to go find again that say things like, if you get a pull request, you get a commit from someone else, or you get a contribution from someone else, you should respond to that within at least 48 hours to ensure that they're not going to just drop it. The vast majority of people who do submit code to other projects tend to do it in a drive-by fashion. I've seen this happen a lot. They show up, they're like, here's a thing, and you're like, cool, and then you never see them again. And that's fine. That's fine. There are only a few people who may stay for a long period during that project. But ultimately, being attentive to the community, responding to issues, responding to pull requests, if you have a chat system or a mailing list, try and get to that as soon as you can. The more you water your garden, essentially, the more you're going to grow, which is awesome. I will say, as a caveat on this, if you're an open source maintainer, like someone like myself, there is a bit of a trap here, because the more that you put into your project is the more you get out, but there's no limit on the amount that you can put into your project. So just set some limits for yourself about how much time and effort you're going to put into the project. Set some good, healthy boundaries, which is good for everybody. And and then you can maintain that over time. You could spend all of your waking hours doing free work for open source, and everyone would be like, "This is amazing," but just keep it healthy. That's all I'm saying for that. But yes, being attentive is hugely, hugely useful. The more attentive you can be, the better it's going to be for all of those people. Write good documentation. So we were talking a little bit before about, you can put so much time in, and like there's a trap there. Good documentation is a great way of making yourself scale, or basically making it so that your maintainers scale. Good documentation means that when people come to your project and they want to know answers to questions, ideally they should be able to see it in that project documentation, and they can learn what it is they need to learn. Also, it means if someone just kind of misses it for whatever reason in their documentation, and they come to the chat room and they're like, "Hey, I can't find it," it's much easier for the person in the chat room or the mailing list to be like, "Hey, cool, don't worry about it. Here's the documentation over here. Let me know if you have any questions after the fact." Right? That is a much nicer experience than being like, "I've done this 15 times and I have to explain it for the 16th and I really don't want to because I'm tired." That sort of toil. Much better to be like, "Oh, actually I've answered this question 3 times. I'm going to write some documentation, and then when the next person comes by, I can point them to it, or maybe they'll just see it in the first place." Good documentation scales and is very, very important for the health of your project, and means you get high engagement as well, and lots of people using it, which is kind of the whole point. Speaking of toil, I also say automate as much as possible. The more boring and repetitive it is to be involved with the project that you're working on, especially if you're a maintainer like myself, and the more you can make computers do it, the easier it is. And the more you can focus on the fun parts of doing open source, building cool new things, or engaging with the community and talking to people and getting feedback and all that nice dopamine, endorphin, kind of stuff. That's great. So rather than being like, "Oh, I need to run the tests every time," right? So usually this is things like continuous integration, having automated tests for your project, making sure everything works the way it's supposed to. Somebody submits a pull request, something they want to commit some stuff. They have an idea for some things, have computers run those tests. Make sure that all works appropriately, and then report any errors that come back. By the same token, if you can automate things like releases, like we do a release every 6 weeks, it's not the most automated. It's a lot of manual. We have at least a checklist, which is great. It'd be great if I actually sat down and automated more of that. And we sort of iterate on that as well as much as possible. If you have a small project, usually having just simple like continuous integration CI type stuff for just running those tests is usually an easy way to do it. And there's a lot of free services that will do that for you as well. But anywhere that you find that you're like, I wish computers would do this for me, or this is boring and I don't want to do it. Try and automate that as much as possible, because it's just going to make your life a whole lot easier and just enable you to be more engaged and help you scale actually more than anything else. Awesome. Finally, on the list of successful projects, there are a lot of models for governance inside open source, and they're wide and they're varied. I'll give you my favorite. I think my favorite perspective on this. I think it's really important to be transparent. You can run open source projects as like what comes from us, and if you don't like it, bye-bye, that's fine. But I think you're missing out on a lot of the power and a lot of capability of open source when you do that. So what do I mean by be transparent? Have decisions get made in the open. This can just simply be design tickets that sit inside issues in GitHub. And if anyone's interested in getting involved, they can write a commentary there, or maybe start their own GitHub issues. Have a written process for how decisions get made within your governance structure. Maybe hold monthly community meetings where people can come and talk about stuff. Have an open and inclusive culture. All these things, I think, really help ensure that you have the widest set of people that are interested in your project, being involved with your project, providing feedback, taking advantage of it, using it, developing on it. Being transparent, like from the outset with everything you do, with no exceptions as much as possible, I think is really important for setting the tone for your project and really just making sure that you have a wonderful space for everyone to get involved in. But yeah, this can be really simple. Like I said, I just want to sort of hit home this point. This doesn't mean I think you need anything complicated for that. It just means when you're maybe, like if you're a company and you're building stuff, this happens with us. We're like, it'd be really cool if we had this feature for such and such, and it'd be great. And I'm talking to like some internal engineers or something like that. Then we go, you know what, we'll write an issue for that. We'll put it out in the community. We'll get some debate on it, get some consensus. And once we have consensus, then we're going to go build it. And I think that's a really good way. Everyone feels like they're involved. They feel like they have ownership, and they're much more motivated to get involved and do more fun stuff. And this is just something we've repeated in the project I work on a lot, and I think it's done us really good, and given us some great perspectives on how to build stuff. And we've come up with solutions that we otherwise wouldn't, which I think is really powerful and really beneficial for the project as a whole. Okay, so we've talked at the project level. Let's talk a little bit about the individual contributor. So the individual level, you're like, hey, this sounds amazing. I want to get involved at least in the individual level. How do I do that? What's a good way of being a successful contributor? And contribution can mean a number of things. We'll talk about that as well. So first things first, be kind. As I said before, open source, a lot of people are doing this for the passion. They're doing it for the fun and the enjoyment of doing it. And ultimately, they can always take their toys and go home, like we were talking about this previously. And it doesn't cost anything to be kind. So, if something's not working for you, come in and be like, hey, look, I'm having this trouble, but, I'd love it if you could help me. And they give you a solution, and then you're like, thank you very much. I really appreciate it. Like, that's easy to do. So being kind can go a long way in helping, motivate the people who are building the software, because we want more stuff to work on, right? Like, we ultimately, from like a pragmatic and commercial point of view, I want them to be building more stuff that I can take advantage of on my end as well. So being kind goes a long way. So yeah, just put a little bit of sugar on it. It's always well appreciated. A couple of emojis here and there also helps as well. If you're starting to get involved with a new project, I recommend starting small. A open source project is a community. It's a social structure, just like almost anything else, right? If you're walking into a new group of people you've never met, being loud, boisterous, intrusive sometimes doesn't work very well. Getting to know a few people, sort of iterating, learning a few more, slowly getting to know everyone that's going on, often is a really good strategy for getting to know everyone at a party. All right. We all have different structures. Don't get me wrong, and they all work to a greater or lesser degree, but I'm just saying, like, starting small can just be a nice way of getting involved. And ensure that the sort of stuff that you want to do down the line is well received and you're engaged with on it. So that can be like small code fixes. It can be documentation fixes, or maybe just, stepping into design tickets and providing feedback on designs, that kind of stuff, or doing code reviews is always well appreciated. Anything along those sort of lines is always a good thing. And people get to know you. And that's always great, right? That's, I think, a really good thing. And also it means that, like, if you're actually interested in being around long-term for the project, you're building trust over a long period of time. And that's where you can be handed responsibilities, because there is that relationship that exists. Super important. Yeah. So I think with starting small is a really good thing if you want to get deeply involved with the project. Oh, this is one of my other favorite ones. Read the contributing guide and follow it. A huge number of projects have contributing.md, like a markdown file that exists in their project. It has an outline of the sort of things that they want when people come and contribute in a variety of ways. Everything from like code formatting to like how they expect PRs to be done, that kind of stuff. This is usually just to streamline their experience, take away that toil they were talking about previously about maintaining a project. So just, if you're going to contribute, especially code, have a look at the contributing guide, follow it. Just usually it's really easy to do. And it just means that whenever you do stuff, no one's going to be like, that's great. Thanks so much for that. Unfortunately, I need you to do these 3 things that are in the contributing guide. Please. That'd be great. It's going to make our lives a lot easier. So please, yes, follow the contributing guide 100%. It helps so very, very much. Awesome. I've touched on this a bit, but I also just want to highlight as much that contributions very much do not have to be code. There are so many ways of getting involved in a project that we were just talking about. So yes, there's coding. There's derivatives of coding. So like doing code reviews, helping on design docs for how to implement stuff, things like that. That's always good too. But don't forget, there's documentation help is always the good one, helping to triage bugs, right? Like what's most important, or tagging them as appropriately, fixing spelling mistakes. But even things like, for a lot of projects, maybe there's like UX work, user interface design work. Maybe there's graphic design work. There's release management, like how do I get releases out? So many different ways. Even just hanging out in a chat room and helping out new users that are coming in is releasing burden from the maintainers to do more coding work. We've actually recently had someone come in our project that has been ramping up, maybe even over the last 6 months, and they're hugely visible in the chat, the project I work on, and it's been so very useful, and they've just become a go-to person now, which is fantastic. So anything that you do that gets involved with an open source project is great. Like, it's just great, and so please don't think that you're like, maybe you're not like the best coder in the world, or you're like, whatever. Like, every little bit helps. So please don't feel like it's an intimidating space because of that. There are so many things you can do and that kind of stuff as well. Even filing just issues and bugs is hugely useful, because at the end of the day, if you don't tell us about a bug in a system, then we may not know about it. And if we don't know about it, can't fix it. So yeah, contributions definitely don't have to be code. All right. Before we finish up today, I want to check some resources at you if you want to learn more. Contributorcovenant.org is a great place to start. That is a code of conduct that you can pretty much just lift and drop into your project and follow. It's used by a lot of open source projects, very well maintained. They've had several versions of it. Definitely check that out. That is very, very useful. If you want to dig even deeper, opensource.org, opensource.guide, opensource.dev, opensource.google.com are fantastic guides from everything from how do I do a pull request, how do I get started in open source, how do I release open source, all the things. Opensource.google.com talks a lot about how we do open source inside of a very large company. This is all hugely useful stuff. So if you want to know anything about open source, you can definitely find it in one of those URLs. I have one at the bottom there as well, todogroup.org. If you're a company that's interested in getting involved more with open source, what you may also want to do is measure and track whether or not you're meeting the goals that you initially set for what you want to do with that open source. Todogroup.org actually has what they call an open source programs office in a box. It's basically how to set up a program office inside your company for tracking, setting up procedures, how to deal with legal stuff, all this kind of fun stuff for how to run open source inside a company. So if you are interested in doing that, I very much recommend making sure you check that out. Also, if you're like, what are some great open source projects? Some of these I know better than others, but I'll just go through quick ones. So I work on Agonez, so agonez.dev. If you're interested in backend infrastructure stuff, by the same token, straight plug, openmatch.dev is another sibling project of ours. It's a matchmaking framework that also came out of Google Cloud. So those are the things I work on. But there is a bunch of open source out there. Just talking about engines even. Godot is one that a lot of people know. I feel like Senko is one that people don't know as well. Coco2D, Default, the King engine went open source, I think last year. That's also out there as well. Phaser.io is an HTML engine for making multiplayer games. It's super cool. There's some really cool stuff going on in the Rust community as well. I'm a huge fan of Rust as an open source programming language. So Amethyst is an open source Rust engine. Most recently, Bevy is another one that's had a huge amount of hype as well, both of which look really interesting. You should check them both out if you're interested in Rust. And speaking of Rust, I'll actually highlight one company that I do some work with, and they're amazing. Embark Studios in Sweden. They've been just driving so much open source, and especially the Rust side of things, as well as just being a huge open source advocate in the games industry. Check out their GitHub account. They're doing some really cool stuff, a lot of which I don't understand because I do so much backend stuff and I don't understand how the front end stuff works. But yeah, I think they're doing some really cool stuff. So if you want to check out a company that is very, very dedicated to open source, do check out Embark Studios. They're doing some really cool things. So finally, call to action. Yeah. I just want to see more people in the games industry talk about open source, adopt open source, create open source, be involved with it. I want to hear people talk about it at conferences, at meetups, online, in videos, in engineering blogs. I just want to see just an explosion of open source in the games industry. I just want to build those foundations that we can all share and build together, and do that whole rising tide lifts all boats kind of scenario, where we aren't all reinventing the wheel and we can all take advantage of open source as just this wonderful set of plumbing that we can all build our houses on top of, and just make amazing houses, or just really cool games, essentially, really cool games, and just really drive the next generation of game developers to build just amazing things as well. So finally, thank you so much for hanging out with me today. My name is Mark Mandel. I'll be hanging out on chat If you don't catch me there, you can always catch me on Twitter at Neurotic. Please feel free to fire me questions. I've always loved talking about this kind of stuff. Open source is a huge passion of mine. I know your time is valuable, so I do really appreciate you hanging out with me. And thank you so much, and I'll see you all later.